Thank you for joining us today. Now, Nigeria's federal government has introduced a bill proposing a 5% excise duty on telecommunications, gaming and betting services as part of its efforts to reform the nation's tax framework. Dated October 4, 2024, the Nigeria Tax Act aims to consolidate various tax laws and impose excise duties across multiple sectors. Under the bill, both prepaid and postpaid telecom services, as well as all forms of gaming and betting, will incur this particular duty. Additionally, the legislation seeks to regulate currency transactions, imposing duties on excess values above the Central Bank of Nigeria's official exchange rate. The government anticipates that this new tax regime will help increase non-oil revenue and enhance regulatory oversight in these growing sectors. Well, joining me for more on this, I have right here with me Tajuddin Ibrahim, the Director of Research and Strategy, Chapel Hill Denham Securities. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Dr.
Absolutely. Well, here we are. We're back to 5% excise duty on telecommunications. I mean, what does this mean for the sector?
I think this is negative for the sector to start with. If we look at the telecommunications sector, for instance, we recognize that the sector is currently facing a lot of challenges. And, the major of those challenges are two. Number one is the movement in the foreign currency market in terms of our exchange rates. Number two is inflationary pressure. So the sector has gotten to deal with those two headwinds to their business, but the sector operators in the sector have not been able to pass any form of tariff increase to consumers. So when we now bring on a 5% tax, to that sector, it further puts a downward pressure on the performance of the telecommunications sector and also, paints a negative outlook for the sector in terms of their ability to remain profitable on a sustainable basis, in terms of their ability to invest for business expansion, and also in terms of their ability to attract investors into that sector for it to grow further. So in summary, it is negative for the telecommunications sector.
Well noted. Now, do you think this bill shows, a disconnect between the government and the plight of businesses, especially the telecommunications sector? I mean, this is a sector that has been reporting losses quarter on quarter, and the government, just like you said, has not allowed it to adjust its rates, irrespective of the high cost of doing business in the country. This is stifling, isn't it? I mean, what do we call it?
It's stifling, and I reckon that, instead of implementing this kind of, tax on the sector this time, I think this is not a good time for the government to implement, the tax. I reckon that, the government can consider a gradual implementation. If it is 5%, why doesn't the government consider 1%, this year or next year?
Let me come in, Mr. Ibrahim. Mr. Ibrahim, let me come in. Why should it be the telecommunications sector, actually? Because you're talking about 1%, which means you sort of agree with the tax. You're just looking at the fact that it's too much at 5%. Why should we be talking about that at this point in time, looking at what the sector is going through? Should we be talking about that?
So I recognize what the sector is going through. I said that earlier, which I believe, and I said to you that this, to my mind, is not the right time for the government, to bring on a tax, a new tax into the sector. Nevertheless, we recognize the fact that the sector is one of the largest, sector in terms of contribution to the overall economy. It is on the forefront in terms of the accretive impact it has on the gross domestic product. So we recognize that fact. So what I think is that the tax should be implemented over a lagged period, maybe like the next 3 to 5 years, instead of imposing a 5% outright. That is what I think. But in terms of the government's need, there is need for the government to generate more non-oil related, tax income, to be able to execute projects across the country, particularly to be able to spend on capital expenditure. We cannot really take away this from them. But what I recognize is that they have done it before in the tobacco space, in the beer and stout subsector, and also for wines and spirits, where they were charging gradual increase in the excise duty for those products. For instance, tobacco, for example, per stick, the companies in question were required to pay 4.20 naira per stick,
okay.
5.20 naira per stick.
All right, Mr. Ibrahim, Mr. Ibrahim, I'm afraid we need to go. Mr. Ibrahim, thank you. I'm afraid we need to go on a break. When we come back, we'll continue from there. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. Tajuddin Ibrahim, Director, Research and Strategy, Chapel Hill, Denham. Mr. Rai here with me. Thank you so much for staying with us, sir.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so you were talking about, how that this same measure has, of course, been done in some of the sectors, whether you want to talk about spirits and alcohol and all of that. You can take it up from there.
Yes, absolutely. For instance, if we talk about, beer and stout, for example, in 2022, the government introduced, some special tax, which we can call sin tax in this case, where, the beer operators were charged 40 naira per liter in 2022, 45 naira per liter in 2023, and 50 naira per liter in 2024, which means that, the impact was not, the same for each of the year. It was just an increase over the years. That's why I reckon that the government can consider implementing, this tax on the telecom sector on a gradual basis, considering, number one, the issues that the telecommunications sector is currently facing, as I highlighted earlier. Number two, and possibly more importantly, the fact that it is negative for Nigerian consumers, because eventually, if care is not taken, what most likely is going to happen is that the introduction of this kind of a tax will lead to higher inflation, which means that the government is trying to fight inflation and at the same time is introducing measures or policies that can drive inflation higher. And the result will be negative because the Monetary Policy Authority will be considering further hiking interest rates. So there is need for the government to balance the implementation of the policy, bearing in mind the current sufferings of Nigerians, bearing in mind the fact that the authority wants to fight inflation from the high level that we currently have.
While I understand what you're saying, but I definitely will not put telecommunications and those other things on the same pedestal. We're talking about something essential, something that you want to call a necessity, really. That's what I would call telecommunications. But that's by the way. So I don't run the risk of, only talking about telecommunications. This duty will also apply to gaming, gambling, lotteries, and betting activities in the country. Let me get your thoughts on this and what taxation in that segment of the economy currently looks like.
So I think let us speak about a sin tax. A sin tax is the kind of tax that is introduced by the government on some goods that are considered harmful to the society, also harmful to individuals. That is the basis in which we understand the fact that in 2022, for instance, we had those excise duty on tobacco, on beer and stout, on wines, on spirits, and also on some non-alcoholic carbonated drinks. So when we now come to gaming and betting, they are in the same category. So which means that it will be hard to defend the fact that the government is looking to implement some taxes on those segments. So because their activities, according to global standards, can be considered as harmful to the society or harmful to individuals one way or the other. But when we take a look at the telecommunications sector, I think that is the only sector that is not in line with all of these other subsectors, but there are laws by the government that that have been put in place to support what the government wants to do around the telecommunications sector, except, of course, if they repeal those laws or they roll it back. That is when the sector can be completely free. But as for gaming and betting, I reckon those taxes are appropriate to my view.
Well, let's move on now. I mean, this particular bill also established guidelines for currency transactions, indicating that any variance between the current Central Bank of Nigeria exchange rate and the actual transaction rate would incur an excise duty. Now, isn't this one of the quick win recommendations that financial market players said was counterproductive?
Yes, and the government should focus on is ensuring the stability of the currency. Everything has a price. If exchange rate differential in that regard will be taxed, it will only take some higher level of the differential for economic agents to be comfortable with whatever they get. But will that control the exchange rate, or will it make the exchange rate stable? I don't think so, because the market works on the dynamics of supply and demand. So what we really need to ensure stability is, broadly speaking, increasing the supply to the market. But in terms of those taxes, they can help to boost government revenue. Nevertheless, they will not stabilize the exchange rate, in my view.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tajuddin Ibrahim, Director Research and Strategy, Chapel Hill Denham Securities, for your time and thoughts on Business Edge today. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.